you'll all learn a lot from today's discussion, so please have your questions ready for the end. And I'd like to introduce Dr. Matthew Meselson, who will give a further introduction for himself.
So I suppose I'm, except for Milton Leitenberg, the person who's been involved in this sort of thing the longest, maybe even longer than Leitenberg. So a little bit I'm just going to tell stories, and then I'm going to mix in a little bit of science with the stories. And what I'm almost not going to do at all is talk about what all of you are interested in, which is policy. So anyone who wants to leave, please be free to do so. I'm a biologist. I work at Harvard University and teach there, and my current research is to try to find out what drives the aging process. We don't know what drives it. So I'll start with a little bit of history. Fortunately, at least for now and let's hope forever, the era of biological weapons as strategic weapons is over with, at least for the time being. But there was a time when it was very much with us. So here, for example, is this huge, after it was captured, liberated, Ping Fan establishment in Manchukuo, Manchuria, where hundreds and hundreds of human beings were sacrificed for biological weapons experiments. And detailed records, which you can go and get at the Library of Congress, were kept. People are given numbers. You can see these numbers are rather high, up in the 400s.
Please speak into the microphone.
These particular people had all been placed in a glass chamber and had an unknown amount of anthrax sprayed because they weren't doing any dosimetry. No reasonable science comes out of this, none at all. Pathoanatomy, yes, and that's what those diagrams are, is we're on these particular 5 people, who generally were just people who they go into the nearby city of Harbin and grab off the streets Chinese people, and some Russians, and arguably maybe some Americans. It's not sure, at least I don't know. But it was a terrible, terrible thing. During the war, the British asked the United States, because big industrial projects were more difficult to do in wartime England, to construct a factory for the production of anthrax to be loaded into British 4-pound anthrax bombs. And this was built in Vigo, Indiana, and it had 10 20,000-gallon fermenters. It never made anthrax. The war ended before it went into production. What were made were the so-called cattle cakes in England to give cows in occupied Europe anthrax. After the war, we built a much more modern facility for mass production of biological warfare agents at Pine Bluff in Arkansas. And then, as you know, President Nixon totally renounced offensive biological weapons and warfare. So I want to tell you a little bit about the history of that. What does history really even mean? It's something in our heads. It's something on pieces of paper and on wires or tapes or discs or whatever is the next digital medium to come along. Probably something like a liquid or a DNA molecule that you read. It has the highest information density. So what was behind this? Well, I don't pretend to know, but each person who had some little part in it has some stories to tell. So the earliest event I know is way before most of the stories you read. It was Dean Rusk at a staff meeting at the State Department in 1963. Amongst many other topics, the Secretary of State said he would like thinking to be given to the possibility of banning biological weapons and coupling the ban to some sort of international peaceful program in biology generally. And in the audience was a staff member, not actually from the Department of State, but from the old arms control, and well, it wasn't old, that was its second year of existence. Old in the sense it doesn't exist anymore. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, ACDA. That was Frank Long. I don't know, some of you will remember Frank. Frank was a chemist from Montana who then went to Cornell after ACDA, and he was head of what was called the Science and Technology Bureau at ACTA. And I was there as a younger as a summer full-time consultant. I had a little office, and my office mate was Freeman Dyson, the physicist from whom I'd taken my first quantum mechanics course at Berkeley. So he was an amazing man. I would sit there writing papers and filling wastebaskets to make one page of written text. Freeman would take a ream of white paper, write on it, turn that page over, next page, turn it over, then turn the whole heap back, strike out a few words, nothing's in the wastebasket. Amazing. So what I had to do was to go see what we were doing and to go see what we thought other people were doing. So I went to the CIA, and at that time we didn't know what other people were doing. We were confused. We didn't have very good imagery, and we didn't know for sure. We had suspicions about the Soviets, which turned out to be correct. As far as what we were doing, I went to Fort Detrick, and a very nice man who was in the beginning of the program, Colonel Leroy Fothergill, took me around, and he showed me this 7-story building that has what look like windows, except they're phony windows to make spies think that they are windows. There's a big fermenter inside to make anthrax. And I asked him, why do we want to do this? He says it'll save money. It's cheaper than nuclear weapons. I don't know if I immediately saw the insanity of this, but by the time I got back and told it to Freeman, he agreed and was very encouraging. So I wrote papers saying this is nuts, because after all we had nuclear weapons, and why would we want to spread something around that would give every country mass destruction capability? And I went to see all the people I could go see. I went to see Mac Bundy, who was the dean who had hired me, but by then he was President Kennedy's and then later President Johnson's national security advisor. And I never talked to anyone who disagreed with this. But there were people who had other things to do. And in fact, that was everybody had other things to do at that time. The war was beginning in Vietnam. And Mac said that it was the sort of thing he couldn't really do much about right now, but he'd keep it out of the war plans. As a result of that staff meeting that Rusk had, Frank Long wrote a memo to his director. That was William Foster. Jack Kennedy created ACTA with a lot of suspicious people wondering why would we have an agency for disarmament, arms control and disarmament agency. So you had to put a respected Republican at the head of it. And that was Bill Foster, who was a great man. And he wrote a memo to Mac Bundy in October of that year saying, let's reappraise the utility of these weapons and the possibility for banning them. And Mac Bundy wrote back saying, well, why don't you do that over in your shop? Which I think reflected partly the fact that he was very busy. After all, nuclear weapons were the first priority. And the NSC was quite a bit smaller then. So for a while, it was just Foster and Rusk who were trying to get something done. Defense was generally not interested. Mort Halperin, who was on the scene then, tells a story. I don't know if it's true, so I'll just say that it's true that Mort tells the story. And the story is that McNamara received this request from ACTA to have a principals meeting on this question. And so naturally he referred it to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs naturally gave it to the Army chief because it's an Army project. Fort Detrick is Army. The Army, according to Mort, Army chief gave it to his chemical colonel who's there in the building at OSD. Chemical colonel apparently thought, not a good time, and told that to the Army chief, who probably thought, according to Mort, why should I pick a fight with my chemical colonel? Who then told his chairman of the Joint Chiefs, no, it's not a good time. And the chairman might have thought, why do I want to pick a fight with my Army chief? And so without much conviction on any side, maybe he told, if Mort's story is right, Secretary McNamara that it's not a good time, and McNamara certainly didn't want to have a fight with his chairman. So he tells Mac and Mr. Foster, not a good time. So defense didn't play until somewhat later. Really began in 1968. And then the Defense Department did come up with a proposal, and it was a proposal to expand our BW capabilities and CW capabilities greatly, in fact. Now, what was the logic? There was a logic. The logic was what we have now is quite small and not very good. So why would you want something that's small and not very good? The likely thing is you'd want something that is good, bigger. That was really the logic. It followed once you accept the idea that we're going to have them, then why should we have this miserable little capability that we got? You couldn't really use it in a big strategic sense. So they wrote a paper saying to increase it greatly. But by that time, there's something else in the building, the Office of Systems Analysis, a completely different mindset. These are mostly economists, headed by Alan Enthoven. And under him, a man named, and he's still alive, so you could go talk to him. So we're talking about history, and anybody who really wants to dig into this, because you better hurry up. As I go through this, I'm going to mention living people. So he's still out there, so far as I know, at Stanford. And the person more directly responsible, Ivan Selin. He's living in Florida. He's in good shape. You can find him having breakfast at the Four Seasons quite often here. And under him, a fellow named Hans Schweider, who's also still around in Virginia. So their report was completely different. It tried to ask exactly what kind of engagement would you want to have lethal biological weapons. They couldn't find one because we had nuclear weapons. What kind of engagement would need non-lethal biological weapons? And they came up with one scenario, and that scenario was there's another Korean War, we're losing, we're being pushed into the sea, tens of thousands of Americans are going to be captured by the Chinese, and we'll make all those Chinese very sick with non-lethal biological weapons, we'll kill a few percent, and that will give us time to load all of our soldiers onto ships and save their lives from being war prisoners. And they actually concluded this is such an unlikely event that it's not worth having non-lethal biological weapons for that reason, because if we do pioneer biological weapons, they will undoubtedly be more popular in other countries as well. We won't be able to oppose. So it was a combination of considering military utility and the danger of proliferation. Not one or the other, both. And then they went through the same logic. And if you want to read this, almost word for word of what was in the still classified document, a large part of it was in a document. So every year at DOD they prepare, or used to prepare, something called a DPM, the Draft Presidential Memorandum, on all kinds of big strategic-like subjects. And that's where this argument was made. But Hans Schweider left systems analysis just about that time when President Nixon made his decision, slightly before, and wrote a paper. And if you read that paper, you will be reading very nearly the exact words that went to the White House. So there was this paper saying it's bad for proliferation and unnecessary, militarily not useful. So at this point, both of these papers, one saying no and one saying yes, went to this committee of principals. And Melvin Laird then saw that the Defense Department was speaking with two voices. So he retracted both papers and asked for an extra month, extending the deadline for the study by 1 month into September of 69, into August of 16. I'm not sure into what month. By 1 month. I forget the exact dates. Okay. There was a background sort of drumbeat to all of this. All kinds of things were being written about in the press. There was a death of 5,000 sheep in Skull Valley, Utah. It's still not absolutely certain they were killed by nerve gas, but they probably were, at least some of them. And maybe the farmer who owned them shot all the rest, because who would buy his sheep if some were known to have been contaminated with nerve gas? And he could get paid per head for the ones, for all of them. So I don't mean to assert one way or the other. There were experiments going on at the time. There were claims that a little bit of nerve agent was found in the blood of some of the sheep. It certainly makes sense that if you had even a small number of sheep dead of nerve gas, that the market value of all the rest of your sheep you would perceive as being much lower. So anyway, 5,000 sheep sounded like it was a lot. And then there was a leak of nerve gas weapons on the island of Okinawa, and some people got sick, nobody died, but that got into the newspapers. And then there was a lot of extra unusable munitions at just outside of Shackleton Airfield in Denver at Rocky Mountain National Arsenal that we decided should get rid of. They couldn't be dropped. The bombs couldn't be dropped from high-performance aircraft. And there was also something about a land deal certain people wanted to have that land for residential development. Anyway, the idea was to ship all this stuff to New Jersey, to Elizabethport, put it in ships and sail them out to sea and sink them. And this caused a lot of publicity because governors didn't want these railway trains to go across the country, et cetera, et cetera. And there was a fellow who really made this very well known in the Congress, Max McCarthy, who was a little dynamo of a guy. He devoted himself to this subject of exposing all of the scary things about CBW that were going on. A fellow who really was a genius working for him, who was on dialysis at the time, but an unsung hero. His name was Wendell Pigman. Well, since in 1963 I already had gotten sort of stunned by this idea that they'll save us money, let's have biological weapons, I spent, well, you were in the lab where I was. Janet was in the lab at that time. I was away a lot. And since at Harvard you get to know all kinds of important people, I was able to walk into lots of doors and say, look, this is a bad idea, we have to stop it. Another thing that was going on, which Milt took a big part in, was the production of a petition to President Johnson, simply asking for a review, not saying ban them, just a review of our CBW policy. And eventually it was signed by about 5,000 scientists. And we delivered it. You can deliver it to President Johnson. We get 5 minutes, we were told, or you can spend half a day with his science advisor, Don Hornig. Being scientists, we made the mistake of thinking it would be better to have a whole afternoon to talk instead of 5 minutes. So it wasn't a big mistake, and that got into the papers, and lots of other things were happening. And the story is, I don't know if it's true, but Mel Laird is alive, and although I understand he has trouble walking around, that his mind is still very sharp, so you could go ask him. He met Max in an elevator, and Max bent his ear very strongly about this huge public outcry about CBW. The Quakers were very active, and journalists who had never heard of the subject before were making their reputations by writing about it. So against this backdrop, Laird sends a note which is in Henry Kissinger's inbox when Henry takes over as National Security Advisor. Now President Nixon is in the White House. 1969 has begun. And the letter from Laird says that there's a lot of bad press and the Congress is awfully interested in this and the policy is in disarray. We need to evaluate it and have a study. And Henry wrote back immediately that he fully shared your concern, were his words, and asked the president to issue what was called a NISM, National Security Study Memorandum, number 59. And Kissinger had a very active, bright, young guy who handled this. His name was Michael Guhin. He's still alive, very much so. And the method that was used by Kissinger was very interesting. I don't know that he used it in all cases. In fact, he didn't. Halpern's written a whole book about it, about presidential styles and such things. What he did, instead of, see, what Eisenhower used to do would be to ask each cabinet secretary, what's your opinion about this issue? What should we do? Period. Good. Another approach, which was Clinton's approach, according to Halperin, was to ask each agency head or cabinet secretary, what's your recommendation on this particular issue? But if there's any dissent in your shop, I'd like to know that. Well, that's better, but would you want to go up against your secretary? Maybe not. What Kissinger did, at least in this case, was to insist that everybody who had a recommendation should also argue both sides, which put young Mike Guhin, just a kid from USC who had worked on the Nixon campaign in California, in the position of saying to generals, General, you've really produced a lot of data and graphs, good stuff here to show why we should beef up our biological warfare program, but your data on why we should not needs beefing up. Oh. So this preserved all the options for President Nixon. Nothing relevant got left out. I think it was a marvelous way to do it, at least when you really want to get the right answer. If you want to get an answer that's predetermined, you know the answer you want. Maybe there are other ways. But that's the way that review went. And there's an interesting memo about this confusion over at DOD. You can see it on the, I think it's on the web, but it's in the, you can get it by Freedom of Information. So remember, Morton Halperin was initially Henry's chief guy until there arose the question of whether his more phone was being tapped and there was a lawsuit. Big mess. But here's the memo. August 28, 1969. So the review was well underway. Until a few weeks ago, DoD inputs into the study reflected the JCS view that we need a greatly expanded CBW capability. Secretary Laird, apparently at the urging of systems analysis, has now withdrawn all the DoD papers and is having them rewritten. Laird has not given any indication of where he stands on the issue. DoD has requested a 1-month extension from the original due date of September the 5th. My point here is that systems analysis is the hero here. I think they were the ones who made these really powerful arguments, both parts of the argument. Someone who also was in systems analysis, but very close to Laird, is General who lives in Stamford, Connecticut, and you could go talk to him. So, Nixon, as you know, proposed what's here, and also proposed that the United States, that the Senate be given the old Geneva Protocol again, which had been withdrawn, again to seek their advice and consent to its ratification, and that the United States would support in general, with some modifications possibly, the British draft proposal for a convention banning biological weapons. And there's a whole lot of history written about that and what was happening in Geneva. Then there was an off-the-record press briefing, and I forget his name at the moment, but the guy who was the military correspondent of the New York Times, he always wore a Burberry. Indoors, outdoors, always wearing, so it really looked like a sort of either a spy or a foreign corps, something really good. He was tall. And I have the transcript of this thing. At some point, he says to Henry Kissinger, "What about toxins?" And there you can see Kissinger saying, "What are toxins?" They weren't in the original review. There had been part written about toxins, and it was decided that this background paper for the president was already pretty big, and to add toxins, just too much to read. And these were the guy who decided to leave it out was a non-scientist. Anyway, the president and Henry had not thought about toxins. So NSC staff came up with 3 options. Toxins are not living things. They're just chemicals. And we're keeping chemical weapons, so we're not renouncing them. Option 2. If the toxins are made by living things, snakes, bacteria, then they're biological. And so we will renounce them. But if you can make them chemically in a chemical synthesis lab, well, then those we still reserve the right to use. We don't have any of those yet, but in a few years maybe we'll know how to make them chemically, and we reserve the right to use them in war. Or option 3, no matter how you make them, where you get them, we renounce toxins, namely toxic substances made by living things. So here are these options. And the Joint Chiefs wanted option 1. We keep them no matter what. OSD, well, I don't know what OSD, I forgot. But I know what Mr. Laird wanted in his papers, in his letter to Henry Kissinger. He wanted option 2. And now the president and Kissinger and a whole bunch of people go down to Key Biscayne to have a nice time. You see baby Rabosa over there on Bimini. Who's old enough to remember that? And the paper is all prepared for option 2, the one that Laird wants. But look, all this argument here, this is Kissinger's presumed advice. What did it say? I recommend, somewhere here, I can't see it myself, but I recommend that you approve option 2. And Richard Nixon writes option 3, RN. What was really going on? Did they really change their minds at the last minute? Was Henry instead thinking, why should I pick a fight with Mel Laird, my good friend Mel Laird? I will appear to be backing his opinion, and certainly he's not going to pick a fight with the president, and if so, it's none of my problem. I mean, that's not impossible. I understand you people in Washington do things like that. Do you? So, it's a great mystery. I know that I was at the movies the night that this decision was made, and Paul Doty, my good friend Paul Doty, called me the next morning and said, Henry was trying to reach you last night. They wanted to find your paper called What Policy for Toxins. And they couldn't find it, but they thought maybe, Paul Doty had a copy. I looked for it, I couldn't find it either. And then they called back much later, around 11 o'clock, and Henry said, the decision has been made. We found the paper. It's option 3. I don't know. I argued that we didn't need toxins. We had good things in the form of nerve gas, much better tested, works through the skin. Toxins generally don't, and other things. Besides, it would wreck the credibility of the president. And I quoted something that Steve Rosenfeld, who was the editorial writer at the Washington Post at the time, had written in an editorial during that same week. How can the president renounce typhoid only to embrace botulism? Well, it's nonsense. It's not scientific. It's terrible. But from a point of view of your credibility, if you're the president, what's the point having your credibility savaged over something like toxins? Anyway, that's how we got rid of toxins. And then, of course, as you know, we got the Biological Weapons Convention. But we didn't ratify it till 1975. Why is this? Here's the President of the United States sending it over to the Senate. Everybody agrees that biological weapons are lousy, and all this thing is saying is we won't use them first. We'd already renounced them. It wasn't a question of first. It was never for us. And as far as chemical weapons, we had no problem saying we wouldn't initiate their use so long as that didn't include tear gas, CS. Well, the reason it took 5 years is that it was bottled up in Foreign Relations, Mr. Fulbright's committee. And it was bottled up because a bunch of us thought it was worth taking the risk of losing the whole treaty, especially now that the United States had renounced BW anyway. Worth losing the whole treaty, which seemed very unlikely but possible, for the United States anyway, rather than to have the possibility that it would gradually be eroded by the development of fancier and fancier so-called non-lethal chemical weapons. And the idea of non-lethal war is in any case a silly myth. Here's why. Let's say there's a bunch of enemy soldiers over there, and you're just a soldier, and your officer says, men, don't use your lethal weapons. Use your non-lethal weapons first. But those guys have lethal weapons. So your officer is telling you, please take an incremental risk to your own life in order to save the lives of the enemy soldiers. What are you going to do? Throw a hand grenade at your officer? It's impossible. The only way to have non-lethal warfare is to get all the lethal weapons off the battlefield. Yes, you can invent some very special circumstances, maybe. And systems analysis went deeply into that and came to the conclusion that those special circumstances, at least in Vietnam, essentially never happened. Hardly ever. Why? They argued that when a fire... Well, I won't go into that. It'll take too much time. So, until 1975, and you remember that's the year we got out of Vietnam. The war was almost over with. And that finally, President Ford, by now we have President Ford, has lunch with Senator Fulbright, and they agree that so long as there's an executive order saying that our soldiers can use tear gas in certain very special delineated situations, the rescue of downed pilots, which sounds good, but if I was a downed pilot, I don't want to be blinded by tear gas. I want to find that rope and get into the helicopter. And if all those guys have got his pitchforks, shoot them. The farmers who were trying to capture me, and so on. So then it went to the Senate, and it received the advice and consent of the Senate and the United States, which had proposed the Geneva Protocol way back in 1925, but never ratified it until 1975. So a perfect 50 years, 5 fingers on each hand. It can't be an accident. Okay. So, if you want to learn about that, that was Richard Moose, who's over there in Arlington, probably having lunch with his wife, Maggie, or Jim Lowenstein, who's in Paris this week. And they were involved very deeply in this. They were the guys who were doing this. And you could go talk to them and find out what was really happening from their point of view. Okay. Right now there are, I think, at last count, 165 states parties. Now you can be a state party by ratifying or acceding to a treaty. You can be a signatory. Even a signatory, by signing, has agreed to abide by the treaty. It's just they haven't gone through their constitutional processes. But the executive of the country have said, I will abide by the treaty. There's only one important country that it hasn't even signed. That's Israel. There are two important countries that haven't ratified, but they are signatories, so you could argue that they're bound. I don't know what they'd really do, and that's Egypt and Syria. So there's a little trouble spot over there in that part of the world. Needs help. I would suggest that Israel should at least do what Egypt and Syria have done, sign. Israel had a very active BW program some time ago. I have no idea if they still do. But at the time of President Rabin, they certainly did. They certainly did. Okay. So will the age of strategic biological warfare ever come back? Well, I don't know. But after the protocol was ratified by the United States, after President Nixon renounced BW, after all this, the Soviet Union cranks up this huge program. And Milt's book, you can read by Milt and Ray Zelinskas. Here's just one of the buildings. This is full of big fermenters, like that one. Curiously, there were 10 of these, 20,000 liters. Remember Vigo, Indiana? 10, 20,000 gallon. Were these just copycats and they forgot to convert from gallons to liters? Who knows? They certainly knew about Vigo. I thought that they produced anthrax there. According to Alabek, they never did. So soon after Alabek went public, we invited him to Harvard, and with certain other people, we debriefed him for 2 days. Wine, good food. And I took notes, and because it was important, next time I saw Ken, I showed him my notes, and he said, "That's wrong, we never produced it." What do you mean you never produced it? You told us how you fill these tanks and what kind of inoculum size, anti-foam. I'd asked him a lot of things. Yes, we made it, we never produced it. Well, what's the difference? Oh, making it we had to do to be sure that if the word ever came from Moscow that they wanted it, we'd have the right temperature, the right inoculum size, the right anti-foam, the right growth cycle, the right... But after each of those batches, we destroyed it. So that's the difference in Russian, I guess. You can make something, but producing means for consumption. So they made a lot, but they never produced it. Maybe they produced it somewhere else, but according to Ken anyway, they just made tons of it, but never produced it. Okay, well, that makes some sense. Okay. So will the age of strategic, I don't think it can come back, at least not with the international system and the human species in its present configuration. Maybe in some huge future time, science fiction like something, but we don't have to worry about that unless we solve what drives the aging process. So, but there are emerging infections that nature's out there trying to get us. But fortunately, we're out there trying to get nature. So, and so far, in recent times, we've been winning. It used to be that, huge numbers of people would be wiped out by plagues. We can read about Athens or about the Black Plague, even the influenza epidemic of 1918. We hope nothing like that will happen again, but there are some possibilities it might. Everybody gets a cold, almost everybody, once a year or so. What if suddenly it were lethal? We'd all be dead. Fortunately, the rhinovirus is not lethal, but it sure spreads by touching, mainly. Don't shake hands. It's the worst thing. Bow. Touch elbows. Don't shake hands. It's really the silliest custom. I tell all my friends this and trying to get, and now I notice quite a few people don't shake hands. They touch elbows. So there's some good news about, there are two ways that nasty things could still happen without being strategic weapons. One is from psychopaths or terrorists, and the other is from nature. On the psychopath front, there's good news. What is the good news? The good news is that it's now 11 years since the anthrax letter attacks. So I can say with complete confidence that no one has succeeded in copycatting that event for 11 years. So I attribute that to the assumption that there is no one out there who knows how to do it and wants to do it. Now tomorrow morning it could be different, but what if it's 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years? At some point, people who do what's called risk analysis should look at history. Like if it had been real big terrorist attacks every few months in history, well, it doesn't take much of a brain to do the risk analysis. It's there all the time and big. So I don't know how you crank this kind of information into a risk analysis. It's certainly silly to start with the, what was it, the assault of the somebody on somebody with catapults and dead bodies. Once you see that in a paper, don't read the rest, because it's not serious. It has no relevance to today at all. On the other hand, the anthrax litter attacks do have relevance. What's their relevance? Well, at least the strain was a military strain. And where you come out on whether it came from USAMRIID or not, it did point out that it could have come from there, because we know that at that time the security arrangements could have been improved, and now are improved, though they still don't have cameras. They don't want cameras. So that's good news. There's something else that might be good news. We found the first feeble mutations that make H5N1 flu transmissible amongst ferrets. Why is that good news? Well, because we're beginning to learn the rules of that virus. It would be even better news if we knew all the rules of that virus, because maybe then we could, first of all, detect it coming before it gets big. If it comes out of populations of birds, and there are people who could make the appropriate tests of what's in the birds, or maybe in the first few human victims, and say, wow, this has the mutations that make it spread, and it's also, unlike most flu, nearly always lethal, or 50% lethal. Let's quarantine all these guys, or inject everybody with whatever is the best vaccine and antiviral we've got. So for early warning, this information, once it can be made practical, that's the essential missing link so far. I mean, it's kind of early, but a dipstick or so quick test for those mutations. But that will happen. So that's why I say it's good news, but it's just a little teeny bit of good news to facilitate early warning. There's another facet here. There's a mystery. Why is it that H1N1, which travels very well, we had a big pandemic of it, lots of people got it, but it killed very few. Why is it that it spreads? These mutations that have been discovered in the Netherlands and in Wisconsin, maybe those are not the only maybe there's other sets of mutations that could make something travel between ferrets or between people. Just knowing what the DNA changes doesn't tell you why. To know the protein it's in gives you a little bit of information, but still doesn't tell you why. Now I want to go to something, I think I better skip over this. It's taking too much of your time. Until we get to here. I do want to say something there. Well, I better inject this here. This is a very interesting experiment, not done by Biodefense, but by Stan Cohen at Stanford, one of the inventors of recombinant DNA. When I read the paper, I thought it must be a different Stan Cohen, so I called the number that was listed there, and I asked for Stan Cohen. The guy said, Matt, is it you? Because he's an old man. So what he did was very simple. There's something called the HapMap project, which is to take lymphocytes, cells, from a bunch of people, in this case something like 234 people, some in Africa, some in Asia, some in Europe, all kinds of people, and do their complete DNA genome sequencing. Because we're beginning to understand lots of things that way. But they didn't throw away the cells, they kept them frozen. So Stan got a hold of the cells, lymphocytes, from these two lymphocyte cells from people, and he looked to see the sensitivity of those cells to anthrax toxin, or something very much like anthrax toxin. And what he found was amazing. There were some people who it took 100,000 times more to kill their lymphocytes. Now, we're not killing people here, we're killing lymphocytes. But these guys produce lymphocytes, they're hardly sensitive at all to anthrax. And then, even here, if you even forget these outliers, there's a factor of about 1,000 between the most and the least sensitive here. Now, there's a mystery about anthrax. We don't know for sure, but it looks like there's some people who were exposed to huge doses, and side by side there's somebody who gets sick, but most people don't. Is it possible that if Washington were attacked with the real anthrax that Secretary Cohen waved on television a long time ago, that only me and someone in the other room would die, and all the rest of you guys are over here somewhere? We don't know anything about this. Individual susceptibility, we all say, well, he's resistant, he's got a good immune system, which is just like talking about the weather. But if it were true that there's enormous variation amongst humans, we would be thinking about biosafety, about epidemics, about all these things in a very different way. You'd have a little card that would say what you're sensitive to and what you're not, when you need to take a vaccine or not. This whole field is just beginning to open up. And this isn't to say that this necessarily reflects the sensitivity of people. These are cells. But it suggests that there may be big differences amongst people who own those, from who those cells came. I was going to use the Sverdlovsk anthrax thing as an example of that, because right near the source and far from the source, the incidence was about the same, but the dose must have been very different. And that would be, in other words, if you were killing all the sensitive people all the way up. Now I want to get to flu. It's long been known that influenza epidemics tend to be worse, more likely, pandemics, especially in the winter. And various theories, people are crowding into heated rooms and so on. And it's more humid in general. But when plotted against relative humidity, the correlation was very poor. Correlation of what? Correlation of the survival of the virus, because you can spray in a chamber containing various degrees of relative humidity and measure the decay of the virus in suspension in the air. Or you could actually measure transmission in animals, of course, of the virus as a function of relative humidity. And it's long been known that there's a weak correlation. But that's because these people weren't chemists. A chemist would say relative humidity, why do you care about that? What you want to know is vapor pressure. That's what determines the reactivity of a substance with water, not the relative humidity, which also depends on the temperature. Relative humidity is good for feeling how comfortable you feel. You know, it's hot and humid, you're uncomfortable. It's hot but not humid, you feel better. So you want to know the relative humidity for human comfort, but it doesn't make any chemical sense. When you plot against just the water content, that's the vapor pressure, you get this amazing result. When did you get it? In 2010. There was some Japanese workers had discovered this earlier, but they wrote their paper in Japanese in a minor journal, and even this paper doesn't cite them. Probably didn't know. But look at this, incredible. The drier it is, the virus survives more if you just measure virus survival, and it's more infective to animals. So first thing that says is if there's the likelihood of an influenza epidemic, fill the room with humidity. Humidify it. Then you'll be over here. Don't go there. Now why is this? Why? Nobody knows, of course. But why is it? Why does water inactivate the virus? We don't know. Is it a surface effect? Something about surface tension? Things that happen at the air-water surface? Does it mean we should be prepared to humidify the schoolrooms? You know, Americans don't approach problems like that. They want $1 billion solution to the problem. You mean a humidifier is 59 cents at Target? Well, it can't be a solution to anything. Anyway, I'm a believer in simple, cheap solutions to problems if you can find them, because they're generally the ones you can put into big practice. Why is H1N1 so readily transmitted but not H5N1? Is it something in the goop that's in those particles in the air, the goop made by us? Well, that takes you in another field that's absolutely not investigated at all. Is it possible that the virus, which is interested in propagating itself, like all creatures, right, wants to be alive, reproduce, induces the human being to make some goop which is present in the exhaled droplets and exhaled aerosol particles, which stabilizes the virus? If I was a virus, I would want to do that. And maybe that's exactly what H1N1 does. Has anybody looked to see what's in the goop, in the droplets that are sneezed, or the aerosol particles that are breathed out by somebody with H1N1? No, nobody's ever looked at it. Because nobody's ever, as far as I know, asked the question, is it possible that the virus does things to us to help it? And that's the approach we need to take in understanding how to defeat it. Maybe it doesn't need a vaccine. Maybe there's something else we could do. Drink salt water. I don't know. So now my last subject is the subject of oversight. So to talk about this, I want to use the model, the only model I know, in fact. Is it the Department of, let's just say DHS, Department of Homeland Security. That one extra S up there. So they have something called a Compliance Review Group, which, as I understand it, was invented by a young attorney when he was working there named Rosen. And it's a great idea. And maybe it was almost accident that he came up with it, I don't know. But they have a pretty, as you know, Homeland Security is a funding agency. It gives away money to do things that it wants to have done. And the annual budget for research and development a couple of years ago, this is slightly out of date, about nearly $1 billion a year. It's a lot of money. Well, this compliance review group is, first of all, it's a group made up of very high-level people. The general counsel, the deputy secretary, the what's it called, the assistant secretary for science, the main intelligence guy. And they meet often. What do they do? So I'll use this. So they call for abstracts from projects that have been approved as being scientifically meritorious. They don't judge the science. That's already been done. And they divide these projects, these proposals, which are not at the program level, which is a whole bunch of experiments. It's the project level, much lower, individual projects, laboratory projects. Category 1 is, it looks as though there's no non-compliance with treaty issue here, not even a perception of it. No dual use concern here. You get a pass. And they've, as of the date, and I think it's about this information at least a couple years old, at the time of this information, about 3 years ago, they had passed 368 projects. Or it could be something that at least has a perception of a non-compliance issue with a BWC or the CWC, but no dual use concern. So like maybe you're building great big bombs, but filling them with water. So that's not dual use, it's just water. Of course, you could argue that water is dangerous, but sorry. So, but no dual use concern. Well, they let through 18 of those, and I don't have the number for those, but there were some that they said, no, you can't do that. And then what about if it looks as though there's at least the perception? Someone could say, this looks like it could violate the BWC or the CWC, or it looks like it could have a dual use concern. Maybe you're aerosolizing anthrax, and that could be dual use. Well, there are some cases they have approved after deciding they don't actually violate the convention and do not actually violate the BARDA terms for dual use. 22 got approved, and some got disapproved. But in this category, and sometimes in this category, members of the committee are asked to sign as individuals and take the personal responsibility for agreeing. Am I right? Is there someone here from Homeland Security? If I make mistakes anywhere, tell me. I believe that this week they're having their 33rd meeting. He's new. Good. Okay. So, it seems to be marvelous. I mean, I'm sure it could be improved, but, and they bring, if there's a concern, they bring the principal investigator to Washington. They also make site visits. They have PhD scientists on there. Are you on it?
I support it.
Yeah. Okay. And they continue monitoring a project. They don't just approve it once and that's it. So, I'm sure it could be improved, but as far as I know, it's better than any other part of the government, so far as I know. DOD has a compliance review group. It was created at the time when we had to ensure our compliance with the ABM treaty. And then it took on other jobs. It's the same bunch of people. I mean, it's the descendants of the same bunch of people. What about the idea of extended oversight? Can we take this model? Maybe it could be improved even at DHS. I'm sure it could. By the way, it's got a staff of about 20 people, and it costs about $3 million a year to run it. It's a big operation. Well, you could get each part of the United States government, each department and agency that does this kind of experimentation, to at least tell us what DHS has told us about how they do it. Why can't DOD publish a little paper saying, here's how we do it, with just as much detail as one of the papers that DHS has produced about how they do it? Why can't they tell us? I'm sure they could. We should ask them to. Maybe the different agencies and different departments could get together sometime, a nice retreat somewhere, pleasant surroundings, and talk about how they do it, with the objective being to harmonize how they do it. I know there may be differences if you're dealing with cows or dealing with school children. There must be something different there. But to harmonize these procedures, maybe they would publish their reports. They don't have to tell. See, the difference here is if you're doing secret work, you don't want to tell the secret, but you can certainly tell how you oversee it. That's a very different subject. Should be nothing secret about that. We have 3 people who make site visits, and they report to this kind of a person, and they look for this and this, and they sign their names to it. None of that's secret. And by the way, can't talk about that, but you don't need to include that. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about how you do the oversight. Maybe there should be, although that's an anathema, I know that different parts of the government don't like to be looked at by other parts of the government, but why couldn't there be an observer from state, and there isn't, sitting in at DHS? They don't like that idea, but nobody would, but maybe it should be done. And then maybe if we could spend a few years improving our oversight procedures, harmonizing them amongst the different parts of the federal government, forget the states, counties, cities, if they do any of this stuff, and present a harmonized United States procedure to one of those intersessional expert meetings of the BWC that happens between review conferences. The objective being to maybe get a few other countries and jointly propose to the states parties at maybe the 8th review conference, which will be in 2016, that all countries be invited to tell, first, do they do any work that could conceivably have a compliance or a dual use implication? And if they do, how do they make sure? Because we're sure they want to make sure, right? No country's going to say, I love to violate the treaties and I really love to have dual use of all my, no. So tell us how you do it. Well, we don't really know how we do it. Well, then we better go find out, right? So that would mean that would improve their procedures, just the necessity of not having to come to school without having done your homework, so to speak. And then maybe by communicating with each other how we do it, we could begin to build up some understanding how each other do it and maybe even gain from that. So the objectives would be to improve the oversight and to enhance transparency and to give the BWC people something to do. That would, I'm not joking. Forward motion is very important because if a treaty is doing nothing, even if it's perfect, it isn't perfect if it's doing nothing. It has to be alive. Treaty is not, there are lots of treaties that don't do nothing and they can wither and die. So with that, I probably talked much too long, and thank you very much.
So thank you. I'm going to quickly introduce Marie Chevrier. She's going to help kick off the discussion. So Marie Chevrier is a professor of public policy and administration at Rutgers University Camden, where she directs the PhD program there. Prior to joining Rutgers, she was the professor of public policy at the University of Texas at Dallas. She's a member of the board of directors of the Bioweapons Prevention Project. It's a great project. You should check it out online. And she's served as board chair from 2007 to 2011. She's the author of the forthcoming arms control policy to be published at Prager Security International in August. She's the co-editor of Incapacitating Biochemical Weapons and the author of numerous articles and book chapters on biological weapons arms control. She received her PhD from Harvard University under the tutelage of Dr. Matthew Meselson, Thomas Schelling, and Paul Doty.
I did have the best PhD committee on record, I think. And I think that's why Kelsey invited me here, because I was a student of Matt's just a few years ago. Just, a couple years, Matt.
When is the committee going to meet again?
We should do so soon. while everyone's still around. I also have a little bit of a background in terms of oversight, in terms of dual use research, and that has to do more with what Milton Lightenberg also actually had a bigger hand in it than I did, in terms of organizing and conducting a meeting where we had members of several different governments, including the U.S., talk about the ways in which their DoD looked at the conducted oversight in terms of biodefense projects. And so I guess I would join in with what Matt had to say in that the process of tension between internal oversight and external oversight, I think, is a question that's really important. And what you've described, Matt, both in terms of DHS and a little bit in terms of DoD, is internal oversight. You've suggested that having a representative of other departments might be worthwhile, and I'd like you to comment a little bit more on the importance of having external representation in terms of oversight.
There's a big resistance to doing it because it can lead to situations which are conflictual, and so there's natural reluctance to allow it. Within the family, fine, but would you want your neighbor to come and inspect your garbage? So there's just a natural human, so there needs to be found some way to get around that. Well, of course, partly to just have observer status, okay? You could make it a little bit less ticklish if you also said, when the person from the State Department sits in on the Homeland Security's Compliance Review Group, he reports to the head of the Homeland Security, not to the Secretary of State. But he brings the perspective of the State Department. In other words, there are various sugar coatings you can imagine. Maybe that's not a good one, but you could, sit down for an hour or two and probably write down some other ones that might make this acceptable. And of course, once you make something personal, people begin to get along and say, oh, that's all right, let him come. And pretty soon it's not so objectionable at all, and maybe he can share the reports with the Secretary of State after all. So the first thing I want to say is it's not a black and white thing. Outside, inside, 1 foot in, 1 foot out, a toe. So there's room for a lot of creative on the part of people who are experts in what you call, I guess, organizational theory or something, to figure out how to do that. Now, the problem with real outside oversight is that the overseers might want to get a reputation for doing stuff, which can be good and can be bad. So they could carry it too far. Every little thing, like you didn't tie your shoelace quite the right way, So you need to build. So what I'm saying here is to just say external. You have to do it right. Otherwise, it'll blow apart or won't even happen in the first place. But yes, it's a good idea. And once people get used to it, it makes a huge difference. Remember all the struggles we went through, inspection of the chemical industry. Boy, the first time this was in the pharmaceutical industry, of course, that was all a big lie anyway. It wasn't the pharmaceutical industry who was so opposed. It was pharma. Because I can say this for absolute certain, because one of my good friends is Roy Vagelos, who is the CEO at Merck. Roy, Dick Garwin's. Anyway, Roy said there's no problem at all. And I could go into at length. But pharma thought it was doing something great, maybe to enhance itself. I don't know why they did it, but they were firmly opposed. I'm not sure that inspection would have been that useful anyway, but initially there can be a lot of fears of it. But once it gets going, I think that, so my advice about it would be, try and do it in an intelligent way, do it gently. A lot will come out of establishing friendly relationships over time of practice until you can make it seem like second nature, and then you're in really good shape.
Now I'd like to have any questions from the floor? Yes, go right ahead.
I'm further than a novice on biocontrol, but I know that we've got things like Law of the Sea Treaty, or all sorts of arms conventions where the Senate, and particularly folks on the right of the Republican Party, are absolutely apoplectic. I can't say that word either. Apoplectic about the idea of the U.S. limiting its potential developments, be it space or sea, militarily. And you're suggesting not just, better internal oversight, but better international oversight, I guess. What are the odds of that, and, conversely, what are we actually protecting against? What is the, for whatever we give up in terms of sovereignty or national pride or trade secrets, which are all the issues that get raised, what are we actually protecting against?
We're protecting against a devastating epidemic that comes out of China and kills all the Americans.
Okay. Because the idea is to get
It's
oversight.
because we all inhabit the same roughly spherical planet. I mean, are you kidding? Infective agents don't stop at frontiers. They don't have passports. So if you're talking about disease, yes. If you're talking about something else like ABM treaties, you're not talking about that.
This is very different from other kinds of arms control.
Very different. I mean, we have the World Health Organization. We are great boosters of the World Health Organization. We don't want epidemics to start somewhere and come here. We don't even want epidemics to start somewhere and stay there. There are numerous costs that anytime you have an epidemic, it's bad for business. Those people don't buy our stuff. Everything's bad about epidemics. Nobody makes any money out of them except a few people.
Milton?
Well, I wanted to make a comment on the question.
Okay.
I would answer that in a somewhat different way. I was responsible for that meeting in 207, 208. And just as you went into back year history on what happened in 69, Ambassador Jim Leonard, who negotiated the BWC for the United States, and Dick Spurzel, who was a former deputy commander at the U.S. Army and had been chief BW inspector for UNSCOM, and myself wrote a memo in 2003, which was published with the title Crossing the Line. And it had to do with the U.S. Biodefense program. And it had to do with the briefing that had been publicly presented for NBAC. DHS, the Biothreat Assessment Center. And we took various lines out of that, which had to do with the nature of the research that was going to be done. They were stipulated in detail, there were 60 points if I remember. And several of these were individually extremely problematical, and as a group, they were even more problematic. The question was the U.S. program, the research program, was that in any way contravening the stipulations of Article 1 of the Convention? So what we're protecting, and I must say, Rosen came up, you mentioned, Rosen was forced to produce that program after that memo. Another little section at DOD, yes, over in the U. And he fought against it very hard. And when we had that meeting, it was very funny. We had Australians, Germans, Canadians, and British, but he spent 2 years refusing to attend the meeting if we invited the Swedes. Why? Because the Swedes were interested in the subject. The Swedes had an opinion on the subject, which none of the other national participants particularly did. So there's a very, very key question. Is there, and DOD has also a compliance review group. So I went to the legal counsel of CRG in DOD, and I said, have you folks ever had a case come up to you, just like that schema you showed for the agents? And the answer was no, never. But that was 205. But I already knew that in 1997 and 98, under Anna Johnson Whittaker, that there had been several such cases brought to her by contractors. And she resolved them. In other words, people in-house knew about the issue. They knew there were constraints. Even the contractor, that was the head of Project Jefferson. But she dealt with them out of her back pocket. It didn't go to an official, formal review process. She just resolved it. Y, and Z, and you can't include Q, and then it's okay, go ahead and do it. So she resigned, but there was no formal mechanism. And state came to that meeting, and state didn't want to even be, they were just a fly on the wall. They didn't want to even be named as a participant in the meeting. So how interested they were to have their hand in it. And then there's a second important aspect. The first important aspect, are we or are we not? Because some of this research goes back even before and back. It goes back to 96, 97. Remember Anna Johnson, she was doing some of those same experiments. And the second is, back to your concern back in 68 and 69, that the US PW program would stimulate others. And there's a question whether this research now on our part stimulates others. Then you get into the whole question of transparency and should you publish. I'm in fact not so happy with transparency because we publish some of the stuff we're doing. It tells them exactly what to do. I'm a bit of a garant for the FAS, but in any case. But this is a very, very live issue. And what the DHS finally came to do is just a wee bit of it.
Matt, would you like to
Yeah.
comment on that?
So I think NBAC is a little better now, but I know all you're talking about. I'm on the Scientific Advisory Board at NBAC, and we meet frequently. As you know, there are two things. Well, the building is owned by Homeland Security, and it's contracted out through Battelle to run it. And there are two things in there. One, as Milt has described, is to define threats using science, using laboratory work. And the other is the FBI's forensic thing, which is called NBFAC. And NBFAC is superb, and it's up and running. The other part is really just getting up the ground. They haven't done very much yet. Of course, there's a trade-off between doing stuff and making other countries say, gosh, they're doing it in America. Can't we have some dollars from our treasury and do some of that over here, and so on and so forth. So what that suggests is that you do only what looks like it's promising to do. And there, I think, is something that could be done, but it's a massive task. There are, first of all, many different government agencies who do work that could have compliance implications. There's agriculture, there's the whole intelligence community, which is really a bunch of different pieces. There's DOD. If you go to Fort Detrick, for example, everybody has to have their own building. The Navy has its nice new biodefense building. Agriculture has a little shop. Of course, the Army has this huge new building. Homeland Security has its building. There's an intelligence operation. There's all kind. Everybody has to have their own. Do they really? And besides, it's like if you're in the same department, you talk to people, and you might get some good ideas or find out that some of your ideas aren't so good. But if you're in another department, let alone at another university, let alone in another country, it's less and less likely. It might have been better, but now it's too late. All these buildings are built. Should there be a review which asks, first of all, what are we doing? And I doubt that anybody really knows the whole picture of all the different parts of the U.S. government that are doing biodefense research. Even forget the development, just what's called research. Once you had a list of what everyone's doing and you looked at that, how much of it is reinventing the wheel? I know several things that really are, because nobody talks to the old-timers anymore. I don't mean me, but other old-timers. Doing stuff that's already been done, and not only been done, it's okay if you do it again, maybe, shows that it was right or something, but don't know the pitfalls that were discovered by the first people who used to do that, about how if you do it wrong, you'll get a wrong answer. Not even that, because after all, new person is hired to do this, doesn't know anything about it. There's enough of a big age gap between the real old-timers and these people who get hired these last few years that they don't even know each other. There's no continuity, very little. During the anthrax letter case, my friends Joe Jemsky and Bud Larson at Detrick, who made this stuff, made aerosols, nobody called them, not even the press. Anyway, so what is not being done that should be done, for example? Like, I think we should know what goop is in the particles that we exhale. What's being done in duplication? 2 labs doing it, same thing. So we might save a lot of money, we might make the whole thing more useful, we might shrink it down. But the worst of all worlds is the world that Milt is painted a part of, and that is where you have a program that's so big and floppy that it isn't really buying you all those dollars worth of anything. For example, please list for me, in the last 10 years, the main scientific achievements of the biodefense program. What? There aren't any. I mean, really scientific achievements, at least not that I know of. What are they? So, there should be some, and maybe there are, but there needs to be some kind of overall review. But it's to be a huge job, and I don't think anybody has the appetite for it. And a very important part is, what is it that we're not doing that we should be doing? So,
Questions in the back. I don't like to ignore the back part of the table. Yes.
I'm not at the back.
That's
part of
okay.
the table, so
I didn't see anybody
as
with
long
in
as
the
I'm
back.
not
if you-
geographically excluded.
Not at all.
Matt, I wanted, Richard Field asked him with the Center on Service Community. I wanted to ask if you are tracking and see any progress in the overall interagency coordination process. It sounds like the answer is no, but I want to ask.
I don't know enough about it, Richard. I try to stick mainly to the science part of all this, because the other, you have to know so much before you can feel even half sure you're not making a big mistake. I don't know. I would like to talk to some people who are trying to do that. You must know, I haven't talked to her yet, Franca Jones. Maybe she knows.
I mean,
It's a very good question. I don't know.
The threat of the global pandemic, the bird flu that kills out of China or wherever. I mean, how much of that is an issue of countries aren't overseeing their own biological research, and if we do a better job, we can get them to do a better job too. And how much of that is stuff that's happening in the natural world where none of this oversight applies? I mean, the natural mutation process in chickens is not going to apply to the Department of Homeland Security for a grant. So I'm not sure how this oversight process catches, that kind of, the equivalent of a Spanish flu or whatever that was the nightmare scenario.
Oh, the only way it would be not what the compliance review group does. It would have to be scientific oversight to make sure that we're doing research that might lead to some simple test that could be done by a public health worker in China to find out if those mutations have begun to appear in the local flu viruses.
And that's
So
not
this
being
is
done now.
I think probably people are interested in how to now begin, but it's very early days. I mean, we just identified a miserable few mutations in one lab that affect ferrets. I don't think we're quite ready to develop simple means for people out in the field to test for those mutations. In principle, it could be done quite readily. But yes, eventually that's the hope for benefit from this, is to be a sentinel, early warning.
And-
But this kind of oversight they do is not the scientific oversight.
Right, understood.
We now have a couple of other people who, now we have a queue. Yes, you, and then Eileen, and then,
Well, actually, I wanted to follow on that.
all right. Is that okay with you? Okay, go ahead, Eileen.
I just wanted to add in the Matt's response that H1N1 influenza A virus in 2009 was discovered actually by accident out of a biosurveillance program that was initiated in 1997 by USAID to look at H5N1 and its variants and where it might be going, circulating around the world. And it just so happened that when the new strain popped up, that they had enough flexibility to say, we've got something new here, and send it off to the appropriate USDA and DoD laboratories for a workup to see whether this really was viewed. And that happened within weeks.
As you know, something similar happened with SARS. It began in Guangdong, China, but there's a fellow who lives near here named Steve Cunyon, who has a pal who was there in China, and he sent Steve a message saying something strange is happening here. Steve alerted people here, and he got a prize from the American Public Health Society for being the canary.
Let's take these last two questions, and then we'll let Matt respond to both of them, because I'm getting
Professor,
3 more questions. Okay, all right.
I'm interested, Professor, to know how successful you think those conventions were. I mean, I think at one point you said, you know, the Soviet Union cranked up this huge project. So presumably they were in violation of
Yes.
of the convention, and I mean, so I was talking to some people about the possibility of treaties to control cyber weapons, and a fellow you might know of called Stuart Baker, who was formerly a senior DHS official and before that worked at the NSA, said, you know, treaties don't work, just look at the biological weapons convention, you know, which basically gave a roadmap to our enemies, he said, you know, to show them how to get us to relinquish, to give them the advantage, right? Because we abide by the conventions and they don't. Could you?
Yeah, well, I think treaties work when they serve to coordinate expectations of sides, all of whom benefit by the status quo and don't want to get into something else because of their own self-interest. So Tom Schelling's book about this is really a beautiful exposition of when a treaty is likely to be stable and useful. If a treaty is seen to compromise the interests of a party, to the party's not getting any benefit from it, yeah, you better watch out. They may at some point want to violate it. So in the case of the Soviet Union, though, Mill and Zelenkus has written this huge book with enormous amount of information about that Soviet program. But inside is still hidden this mystery. Why the devil did they do it? We still don't know for sure. There's an interesting article by Ray Gartov, who was chief Russian expert in the State Department for many years and did many other things too. Ray's still alive. In fact, he's written a blurb on Milton's book. He wrote in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist that we had a disinformation program running for chemical weapons to tell the Soviets that we had succeeded with a certain class of organic chemicals that in fact are a miserable failure, hoping that it would cause them to waste their time and energy. I don't know if it did or not. But that even after President Nixon's renunciation, that we kept the program up and switched it to include biological weapons. In other words, the United States, if this were true, running a program telling the Soviets that our president was lying. Now, obviously, the president didn't know that was going on, if it was going on. When I read that article, I talked to Ray Gartov, and I said, Ray, that's such a horrendous thought that part of the United States government would be telling the Russians that our president is in effect lying. Are you sure that you had that briefing, which was at INR in State, after Nixon's decision? Maybe it was before Nixon's decision, and they shut down the program. He said, no, I'm pretty sure it was after. Are you absolutely certain? Well, I'm not absolutely certain. Well, if it was after, in which case it would have been outrageous, you would probably have had a big emotion, and sometimes people remember emotions, even if they don't remember numbers and stuff. He said, well, I don't know. So then I asked him who else was there. Well, Ambassador Jim Leonard was there. So I went to Jim. Same routine. Do you remember a big emotion? Not sure. So I don't know if this really was going on even after the president made his decision. Ron Spears was there. Another friend was there. And there are 2 more people one could ask this question. And then the person who gave the briefing, who I guess I shouldn't say who it was, I asked if I could go see him. And he's sort of a friend, and he said, oh, I don't know, I have to ask. So I don't know what that means.
I'd just like, there are 2 of us.
But why would the
comment on
Russians
this.
have done it? If we had known
Sorry,
they
yeah.
were violating, we would have announced it and accused them, which we did. If they thought we were violating, they cheat. It's a difference in cultures, isn't it? I think.
I also think there's a real tendency to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So the fact that there is a treaty to which 165 states are parties to the treaty, and we've had one egregious violation since it was entered into force in 1975, doesn't mean the treaty doesn't do any good. There's also ample evidence that for other treaties, specifically the landmine treaties, even states that are not party to the treaty nor are signatories to the treaty are complying with the prohibition on production of landmines. There are many, many fewer countries that produce landmines now than 10 years ago or 12 years ago.
So no simple answer.
So, yeah, I mean, there are norms that are created by treaties and expectations that are created by treaties that don't mean that they are failures, even if they're not perfect. Milton.
Let me add to this story a bit, since there's a whole chapter in the book about it. And Ray Gartock read it, and now it says, read what I wrote. I interviewed 5 of the people that took part in the committee. The important thing is it did go on after the renunciation. It was ended sometime in 71, so it did not pass the time the treaty was signed. That's the first important thing. There's a little caveat to that. How the ending was done would determine what the Soviets thought. But we don't know precisely how it was ended. But the second important aspect, since I had a pile of Soviet Central Committee documents, and a very important member of the Central Committee staff that devoted to the subject, and we also issued very senior people responsible for managing their program from 73 on, much higher than others. There's no evidence in any piece of paper to the Central Committee from the very highest 6 or 7 people ever mentioning this story.
Milton, can I have you finish the conversation? Because we have Janet, who's been very patient about asking her question.
Yeah, we have Janet, and then we have one question from online, and we're running a little bit over time, so we'll try to keep it brief.
I'll try to make it quick. Now, hypothetically, if Ron Fouché and Yoshi Kawaoka had been funded by DHS instead of NIH, do you think that the compliance review group would have identified their work as dual use research of concern and perhaps stopped it for
I don't know.
quick restraint?
I don't
Is that
know.
what you mean by
I wouldn't have
dual use,
stopped
or
it.
do you use the term differently?
I don't know what they would have done,
Okay.
but I know I wouldn't have stopped it. I would have gone to the labs and looked around, but I wouldn't have stopped it. I think it's good work.
Well, I do too, but I think dual use research of concern can be good work
Yes.
and still people
Well,
call.
if we didn't work with things that are dangerous, why work with things that are safe? You want to know about the things that are dangerous.
I'm just,
You know, it's like,
there just seems to be more call.
we'll study only athlete's foot, but not cancer. I mean, crazy.
One online question.
Yeah, we had one question from a reporter online who was wondering what the dangers to the Syrian chemical and possibly biological weapons stockpile are. What are the dangers from the current conflict that's there?
You mean stockpiles that are obsolete and are being slowly destroyed? Or,
Syrian.
oh, Syrian. I don't know what's there.
Okay.
But I do know that one value of the Chemical Weapons Convention is that most countries should probably figure that if they use poison gas, all hell's going to break loose. They're not going to get away with it. Maybe I'm wrong, but I would think that the interest of the major states in not having this thing get going is pretty big. And that would maybe even change the Soviet attitude, the Russian attitude about Syria. I could be wrong, but they're going to use chemicals on their own people? No, I think it's out of the question. But I could easily be wrong. But right now, you know, it used to be right after World War I. Why not? I mean, people have been doing it back and forth. Everybody does it. But now there's a big taboo out there, and we've created the expectation that you'll get punished. So I don't expect them to do it, but who knows? And I don't know what they have. It's always been said they have something. I've never seen the hard evidence for it.
Thank you, Kelsey, for
All right.
allowing me to participate, and I'll
No
let you
problem.
close.
All right, thank you all for coming. It's past 2 o'clock now. Please feel free to mingle, I guess, outside the building. Thank you.
Anyone who wants to buy me a drink? welcome.
Yes.